You think you're tough. In the 1800s, you'd be lucky to survive until breakfast. Imagine waking up in mid-July to a foot of snow because a volcano thousands of miles away literally deleted the sun. Imagine your fashionable green wallpaper slowly releasing arsenic gas, poisoning you while you sleep. Or your doctor curing your common cough by prescribing a bottle of pure heroin. The 1800s weren't a time of top hats and tea parties. It was a 100-year gauntlet of survival horror played on the hardest difficulty. I'm Matt, this is Forgotten Chronicle HQ, and these are 101 shocking reasons why you wouldn't survive the 19th century. In 1816, a volcanic winter caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora destroyed global crops and brought snow to New England in the middle of June. This year without a summer triggered worldwide famine and a total collapse of social order. A massive solar storm in 1859, known as the Carrington event, caused telegraph lines to spark and burst into flames, shocking operators unconscious. The night sky was so bright that people in the Northern Hemisphere could actually read newspapers by the light of the aurora. In 1814, a massive brewery vat in London ruptured and sent a 15-foot wave of beer through the city's slums. The flood leveled 2 houses and tragically drowned 8 people who were trapped in the deluge. A warehouse fire in Dublin in 1875 sent a literal river of burning whiskey flowing through the streets. At least 13 people died of alcohol poisoning because they tried to drink the flaming liquid directly out of the gutters. By 1858, the River Thames was so overwhelmed with raw human waste that the Great Stink forced the British Parliament to shut down. This massive contamination fueled cholera outbreaks that claimed the lives of thousands of residents. The 1811 New Madrid earthquakes were so violent, they caused the Mississippi River to flow upstream for several hours. The tremors were powerful enough to ring church bells as far away as Boston, Massachusetts. Early indoor plumbing often lacked proper ventilation, which allowed methane gas to build up to explosive levels in the pipes. There are recorded instances of bathrooms literally blowing up when a resident brought a lit candle inside for light. During tuberculosis outbreaks in New England, terrified locals would dig up the deceased and burn their hearts to stop the spread. They genuinely believed vampires were feeding on surviving family members from beyond the grave. In the late 1890s, the company Bayer marketed heroin as a safe, non-addictive cough suppressant, specifically for children. It was sold over the counter and widely used before its devastating addictive nature was officially recognized. A popular green wallpaper dye called Scheele's Green was made using lethal levels of arsenic. When the walls became damp, they released toxic gas that killed many Victorians while they slept in their own bedrooms. Victorian baby bottles featured long, thin rubber tubes that were almost impossible to clean properly. These murder bottles became breeding grounds for deadly bacteria that claimed the lives of thousands of infants. Ice cream was sold in small glass cups called penny licks that customers would lick clean and return to the vendor. These cups were rarely washed, making them a primary vector for the spread of tuberculosis in crowded cities. Families frequently hired photographers to take a final family photo with a recently deceased relative propped up to look alive. These post-mortem portraits often featured the dead with eyes painted onto their eyelids for a lifelike appearance. For 2 pennies, homeless shelters allowed people to sleep sitting up while leaning over a taut rope. In the morning, the attendant would simply cut the rope to wake everyone up instantly for the day. Early dentures were often crafted using real human teeth, harvested from soldiers killed on battlefields like Waterloo. Tooth hunters would follow armies to pick the mouths of the fallen clean for a quick profit. To achieve a sickly thin look, some people swallowed pills containing live tapeworm larvae. The parasite would consume the host's nutrients from the inside, often causing permanent internal organ damage. Before it was a controlled substance, cocaine was the standard remedy for children's tooth pain. It provided instant relief, but caused severe neurological issues and withdrawal in young patients. If you fell ill, doctors would often drain pints of your blood in a practice called bloodletting to balance your humours. This practice is believed to have killed George Washington during a standard throat infection in 1799. A common cure for syphilis involved sitting in a box filled with toxic mercury vapor. While it rarely cured the disease, it frequently caused the patient's teeth and hair to fall out. Pure finders made a living by collecting dog feces from city streets to sell to tanneries for processing leather. It was considered one of the most dangerous and disgusting occupations of the entire 19th century. Massive hoop skirts known as crinolines were highly flammable and prone to catching fire on stray candles or hearths. Thousands of women burned to death because the skirts were too bulky to extinguish or remove quickly. Workers in match factories breathed in white phosphorus, which caused a condition called phossy jaw, where their jawbones would rot and glow in the dark. The only way to stop the decay was the surgical removal of the entire jawbone. A teenager known as the Boy Jones successfully broke into Buckingham Palace multiple times, once hiding under Queen Victoria's chair for hours. He eventually became a minor celebrity for his ability to bypass the era's most elite security. In 1859, the US and Great Britain almost went to war over a pig that was shot on a disputed island. Both nations deployed full military forces before the pig war was finally resolved through diplomacy. During the Great Fire of New York in 1835, temperatures were so low that the water froze solid inside the fire hoses. Firemen were forced to watch helplessly as 17 blocks of the city burned to the ground. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for crying babies was heavily laced with morphine and alcohol. It was nicknamed the baby killer because many infants simply never woke up after a single dose. Fasting girls gained fame by claiming they could live for years without eating a single bite of food. While most were hoaxes, one girl actually starved to death while being monitored by skeptical doctors. At World's Fairs, indigenous people from around the globe were displayed in human zoos for the entertainment of Western audiences. They were often kept in horrific conditions and treated as living museum exhibits. In 1835, a New York newspaper convinced the public that astronomers had discovered man-bats and unicorns living on the moon. People actually sent money to fund missions to the moon to convert these batmen to Christianity. A man was killed in London because he was wearing white work clothes, and a neighbour mistook him for the Hammersmith ghost. The shooter was convicted of murder in one of the century's most bizarre legal cases. Before anesthesia, surgeons prioritised speed to prevent the patient from dying of shock. Surgeon Robert Liston famously once accidentally cut off his assistant's fingers while rushing a leg amputation in under 30 seconds. Body snatchers known as resurrection men would dig up fresh graves to sell corpses to medical schools for research. Eventually they stopped digging and started murdering people to meet the high demand for fresh subjects. Women used lead-based makeup to achieve a deathly pale, translucent complexion. This caused their skin to turn grey, their hair to thin, and eventually led to fatal lead poisoning. The Sultana steamboat explosion in 1865 killed more people than the Titanic, mostly Union soldiers returning home from the Civil War. It remains the deadliest maritime disaster in United States history. 2 ships from the Franklin expedition disappeared in the Arctic after the crew succumbed to lead poisoning from their own food tins. The survivors eventually resorted to cannibalism before every member of the crew perished. To make thinned-out milk look creamy, vendors added chalk or plaster of Paris to the liquid. This caused massive intestinal blockages and death in thousands of unsuspecting children. Before refrigeration, butchers used formaldehyde to mask the foul smell of rotting beef. Eating this preserved meat caused chronic stomach poisoning and long-term health failure. For 4 pennies, homeless shelters offered a coffin bed, which was a wooden box for people to sleep in. This was considered a luxury accommodation compared to the 2-penny rope sleep. Victorian moustaches were so heavily waxed that special spoons were invented with built-in moustache guards. This kept hot soup from melting the wax and dripping it into the diner's mouth. The Hunley submarine killed 3 of its own crews, including its inventor, during various testing phases. It finally sank an enemy ship in 1864, only to sink itself and its crew immediately after the attack. Before the 1880s, every town set its own clock based on the position of the sun. This caused hundreds of train collisions until the railroad industry standardized time zones to keep schedules safe. Wealthy socialites would purchase Egyptian mummies and host unwrapping parties where they would unroll them for entertainment. It was a bizarre and destructive social trend among the Victorian elite. On the same night as the Great Chicago Fire, a separate blaze in Peshtigo, Wisconsin killed over 2,500 people. It remains the deadliest forest fire in American history, though it is largely forgotten today. In 1888, a serial killer known as Jack the Ripper terrified London by targeting women with surgical precision. He was never caught, leaving behind one of history's most famous and disturbing cold cases. H.H. Holmes built a murder castle in Chicago, equipped with gas chambers and trap doors to kill tourists. He used the 1893 World's Fair to lure in victims and sell their skeletons to medical schools. Thousands of homeless children in London and New York formed violent gangs just to survive the harsh streets. These street urchins were often recruited by adult criminals for pickpocketing and burglary. Tight lacing a corset could shift a woman's internal organs and compress her lungs to dangerous levels. There are medical records of women dying from respiratory failure caused directly by their corsets. By the late 1890s, radium was hailed as a miracle element and sold in energy drinks. People drank the radioactive water for health, unaware it would eventually cause their bones to crumble and their jaws to fall off. A Victorian invention allowed a machine to smoke a cigar for you so you could enjoy the aroma without puffing. It was a massive fire hazard and failed miserably on the commercial market. The first bicycle, called a dandy horse, had no pedals and required the rider to run while sitting on the frame. It caused thousands of leg injuries and was eventually banned from many city sidewalks. Thomas Edison invented a talking doll that used a tiny, primitive phonograph in its chest. The dolls sounded like a gravelly, screaming ghost and were so terrifying to children, they were discontinued. To preserve modesty, women were wheeled into the ocean inside large wooden bathing machines on wheels. They would step out of the hut directly into the surf so no one could see them in swimwear. To give cheap gin a kick, vendors would lace the alcohol with sulfuric acid or turpentine. This toxic mixture caused permanent damage to the digestive tracts of the working class. In rural communities, sin eaters were hired to eat a meal off the chest of a dead body. They symbolically took the deceased's sins into their own body so the soul could reach heaven. In 1872, the ship Mary Celeste was found drifting in the Atlantic, perfectly intact but with its entire crew missing. No sign of a struggle was ever found, and the mystery remains unsolved to this day. Artists used a pigment called mummy brown, made from ground-up Egyptian mummies, to achieve a rich, unique shade. The practice only stopped in the early 20th century when the supply of mummies finally ran out. Used tea leaves were often collected from the trash, dyed with sheep dung or copper, and resold as fresh. This recycled tea was highly toxic and sold almost exclusively to the unsuspecting poor. Early bicycles with iron-rimmed wooden wheels were so uncomfortable they were nicknamed bone shakers. The vibrations were so intense they were rumoured to cause internal organ damage and bleeding. After a shipwreck, the crew of the Mignonette killed and ate the cabin boy to survive their life raft journey. This led to a landmark legal case that established necessity is never a defence for murder. A popular Victorian sport called rat baiting involved putting a dog in a pit with 100 rats and betting on how fast the dog could kill them. It was one of the most brutal forms of gambling in London's history. NYC's Tombs prison was built on a drained swamp and was perpetually damp, dark and infested with rats. Prisoners often died of jail fever or pneumonia within weeks of their arrival. To make cheap flour look white and expensive, bakers frequently added alum, a toxic chemical. It caused chronic stomach pain and inhibited the body's ability to absorb essential nutrients. In 1883, 183 children died in a stampede because a single door at Victoria Hall was bolted shut. They were rushing toward a stage to collect free toys during a magic performance. The 1883 Krakatoa eruption was so loud it ruptured the eardrums of people standing 40 miles away. The resulting shockwave was so powerful it travelled around the entire globe 4 times. The US Army experimented with using a camel corps for desert transport in the southwest during the 1850s. While they were effective, the soldiers hated the animal's temperament, and the project was scrapped. Travellers in swamps often followed ghost lights, which were actually flickering methane gas. They would walk deep into the bogs, thinking they were lanterns of houses, and eventually drown in the mud. The War of the Triple Alliance killed roughly 90% of the adult male population of Paraguay. It remains one of the most devastating conflicts in human history per capita. Young boys as small as 4 were forced into narrow, soot-filled chimneys to clean them by hand. Many became stuck and died of suffocation, while survivors often developed sweeps cancer from the toxins. Grocers frequently added sand or sawdust to barrels of sugar to increase the weight and their profit. This led to the first major food safety laws being passed in the late 1800s. In 1846, a group of pioneers known as the Donner Party became trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains by an early winter. They famously resorted to cannibalism to survive after their supplies and livestock were exhausted. Electric belts were sold to men to cure exhaustion and impotence via electric shocks. They were useless scams that often left the wearer with painful, permanent electrical burns. In 19th century Paris, the city morgue was a top tourist destination for families on the weekend. People would go to look at unidentified corpses displayed behind glass as a form of afternoon entertainment. Before labour laws, children as young as 6 worked 16-hour shifts in massive textile mills. The machines were so dangerous that many children lost limbs or their lives in the heavy gears. Doctors told asthma patients to inhale smoke from tobacco mixed with poisonous belladonna to clear the lungs. This was believed to be a cure, but it usually just caused severe chemical poisoning. The science of phrenology involved judging a person's intelligence and character based on the bumps on their skull. It was widely used by the elite to justify racial and social prejudices. Pickles were often dyed a bright, unnatural green using copper sulfate to make them look fresher on the shelf. This chemical is highly toxic and caused widespread poisoning among Victorian consumers. Civil War mini balls were designed to expand upon impact, shattering human bone into hundreds of fragments. This made traditional surgery impossible, leading to the massive number of field amputations. In Civil War hospitals, patients with hospital gangrene were separated into isolated tents to die. Because of the era's lack of hygiene, being sent to the gangrene tent was almost always a death sentence. Most tenement buildings in the 1800s had 0 fire exits and only one set of narrow wooden stairs. If a fire started on the ground floor, everyone on the upper levels was essentially trapped in a firebox. When barbed wire was first invented, it caused horrific, deep injuries to farmers and livestock who didn't know how to handle it. These wounds often led to fatal infections before the invention of antibiotics. In the mid-1800s, smallpox was still being used as an accidental or intentional bioweapon against indigenous populations. Entire tribes were wiped out by a single infected piece of cloth or blanket. The Great Flood of 1862 turned California's Central Valley into a 300-mile-long lake for several months. It destroyed the state's economy and forced the state government into total bankruptcy. People in the early 1800s believed eating ground-up mummy powder could cure everything from headaches to internal bruising. It was sold in high-end apothecaries under the name mumia. Red cinnamon candies were often coloured using toxic lead oxide to give them a vibrant appearance. Children who ate the candy suffered from chronic lead poisoning and permanent neurological damage. A massive explosion of saltpeter in a New York warehouse in 1845 levelled several entire city blocks. The blast was so powerful it broke windows and shook buildings miles away from the epicenter. Statistically, 1 in every 10 people who set out on the Oregon Trail died before reaching the West. Most of these deaths were caused by cholera, accidents, and exhaustion rather than conflict. Bubonic plague outbreaks still occurred in port cities like San Francisco as late as the 1890s. The misunderstood disease caused mass panic and led to the forced quarantine of entire neighborhoods. A massive wave of violent uprisings swept across Europe in 1848 as people fought for democratic rights. Tens of thousands were killed in bloody street battles from Paris all the way to Berlin. Public buildings in the 1800s had walls permanently stained yellow from the sheer volume of tobacco spit. Chewing tobacco was so common that spittoons were a legal requirement in many public offices. Hat makers in the 1800s were frequently poisoned by the mercuric nitrate used to process animal fur into felt. This chronic mercury exposure caused tremors, paranoia, and mental instability, giving rise to the famous expression, mad as a hatter. Steamboats used high-pressure steam engines that frequently exploded due to poor maintenance or illegal racing. These floating volcanoes killed thousands of travelers on the Mississippi River every year. The Children's Blizzard of 1888 struck the American Great Plains so suddenly that temperatures dropped nearly 40 degrees in a matter of hours. Hundreds of school children were frozen to death after becoming disoriented in the blinding whiteout conditions while trying to walk home from school. Victorian kitchens used copper pots that, if not properly lined with tin, would leach poison into the food. Copper colic was a common and painful illness among the wealthy who used these pots. People were so terrified of the supernatural that ghost hunting became a massive scam-filled industry. Swindlers used mirrors and smoke to trick grieving families into seeing spirits of their dead relatives. Overfarming in the mid-1800s led to localized dirt storms that choked cattle to death in the fields. These storms were a grim warning of the massive dust bowl that would hit the US decades later. Before Louis Pasteur's vaccine in 1885, a single bite from a rabid dog was a certain horrific death sentence. Victims would die in a state of terrifying hydrophobia and mental madness. Night soil men manually emptied cesspits of human waste by hand in the middle of the night. The buildup of methane gas in the pits frequently caused them to suffocate and die on the job. Tens of thousands of men and children died in unregulated coal mines every year due to collapses and explosions. In 1862, the Hartley Colliery disaster killed 204 men who were trapped underground for days. Early hair combs made of celluloid were so chemically unstable that they could spontaneously ignite or explode if the wearer stood too close to a heat source. There are recorded instances of women's hair catching fire simply because they sat too close to a lit candle or a fireplace while wearing the accessories. During yellow fever outbreaks, houses were marked with a yellow jack flag to warn others to stay away. If you saw the flag, you knew everyone inside was likely already dead or dying. If you lived in the 1800s, you had a 40% chance of dying before the age of 5. By surviving to watch this video today, you've already beaten the odds of the 19th century. 101 reasons. 101 ways the 19th century tried to take us out. From arsenic-laced bedrooms to exploding steamboats, it's honestly a miracle the human race made it to the year 1900. This was the ultimate test of survival, and I want to hear from you. Which of these facts was the most unhinged? For me, it has to be the Waterloo Teeth. Imagine wearing a dead soldier's smile. Let me know yours in the comments. We are pushing hard for that 1,000 subscriber goal to get this channel monetized. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that subscribe button and give us a like. I'm Matt, this is Forgotten Chronicle HQ, and I'm just glad I live in an era with actual doctors.